Well, I want to welcome everyone back. Thank you for joining us as we continue our Determined Truth webinar live stream series. This is our second webinar in the series that we're calling Dealing with Difficult Questions. We hope to kind of offer these events maybe on a monthly basis, and to stay informed about such events, obviously you can send me an email at rdownripple19@gmail.com. Let me put that up on the screen for your sake there, right there. You can send me an email, and I'll add you to the Determined Truth email list, or you can subscribe to the Determined Truth YouTube page, and you'll automatically be notified about upcoming events. I think the YouTube actually sends automatic reminders a week ahead of time and even a day ahead of time. But we began this series of dealing with difficult questions a couple months back with Dr. Dan Hawk, a brilliant Old Testament scholar, done some amazing work on the book of Joshua, especially how Joshua's been appropriated to genocide of Native Americans. But I still have some questions. And so in all honesty, this Dealing with Difficult Questions series is beginning with what my most difficult question, and that is the issue of violence in the book of Joshua in there. So I've invited another guest on with me today. Today I'm going to bring on Dr. Jonathan Walton. There you go.
Well,
And welcome. Thank you for being with us, Jonathan. Jonathan studied analytical and exegetical theology at St. Andrews University, wrote his PhD on the philosophy and imagery of Genesis 2 through 4 in light of its cultural context. He's the author of The Lost World of Israelite Conquest, Covenant, Retribution, and the Fate of the Canaanites, Volume 4. And I found that book to be fantastic. I ran into your father, and I know reading the book, I have a feeling that you probably wrote more of it than your dad did. I think that's, you can be honest with that. And so I'm like, hey, I'd like to have Jonathan come on and kind of help us process this question. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. So let me just start with kind of the beginning. The book of Joshua describes the wholesale slaughter of the inhabitants, of some of the inhabitants. Let me go ahead and read a couple of scriptures, or at least one. Joshua chapter 6, verse 21. It says, they utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. And there are several verses like this, Jonathan, as you obviously know very well, in the book of Joshua. And I find that troubling. How does God ordain, justify what appears to be genocide? How can you help us with this?
All right. So the first thing that we have to do when we're reading the Bible, any part of the Bible, but especially some of these bits that kind of stick out to us, is to remember that it's not written to us. Right. It has relevance for us in the way that we can think about things and the way we can think about God and the world, but it's not written to us. It's not written in a way that's designed to make sense to us. It's not written in a language that we understand. If most people are aware that the Bible's translated, it's right. You've probably only ever read the English version or seen the English version. But if you picked up the version of the Hebrew that it's originally written in, it would be nonsense to you. It would look like scribbles. Right. And a lot of what we don't really understand is that simply substituting out those scribbles for English words is only a very small fraction of the part of trying to get it to make sense, because some of the ideas of what those words mean, those ideas don't actually exist in our culture. Some of the ideas have different connotations in our culture than they would have for them, because the culture that you're in determines what your words mean. And not only that, the entire framework that they use of their values and their priorities is different. So the things that they think are good or bad, what justice or injustice look like, what people ought or ought not to do, what a good, moral, socially responsible person looks like and acts like. All of these are not necessarily the same that they are for us. Some of them are going to be. Right. Most of them aren't, and we should approach with the assumption that it's not going to be. And then if it turns out that there's some overlap, because sometimes there is, then that's well and good. But we should really assume that what these people think is what goodness, justice, looks like, what's important, what's valuable, what needs to be preserved, what shouldn't be allowed to happen. All of that's not necessarily what it is for us. And so when we're looking at these stories, we have to try to interpret what's going on, what kind of story they're telling, in light of what, as far as we can tell, they would have thought about these things, not necessarily how we think about them.
Okay. So what, if I understand that, what you're saying then is what we look at then and go, this is an ethical dilemma. This doesn't make any sense. That it's genocide. You're saying, well, in an ancient context, that's not the way they would have looked at it. So how would they have looked at that?
Well,
then?
what we'd have to do is we'd have to ask, how would they look at that?
Okay, good point.
So Joshua is being told to do something. First Moses, and then Joshua, the commands that God gave through Moses, is being told to do something. So first of all, what are they being told to do? What does that word mean? And what they're being told to do, the word that it translates, utterly destroy, that's not really what that word means. The word is param, and it doesn't really translate to a concept that we have. There's not a clean English word for it. The best one that you'll actually see in some English translations is it's translated as banned or forbidden. And that is much closer to what we can deduce that the word means based on how it's used. And that starts to change the kind of thing you're dealing with entirely, because why would you do this? What does that even look like? But more importantly, we have to ask, when Moses and the Israelites and Joshua hear this command, are they sitting there being like, wait, what? You want us to do what now? Oh no. Like if we imagine ourselves hearing this, right? So it's like, if you're sitting at home in your living room in modern America, and you hear a voice come down from heaven and saying, get up and go to the city over there and put everybody to the sword. You're like, what? We don't do that. It's very contrary to what our values are. It's something that our culture, everything about what we know about good, moral, socially conscious behavior says you should never do this. And that's why it's so hard for us to read. That's why this passage comes to our attention. But based on what we can tell from the rhetoric that people use when they're going to war, or when they're doing things that they're trying to explain as this was a good thing for us to do, they actually use language that's pretty similar to what we see in Joshua. So the idea is the Israelites who are hearing this command, it's not something weird for them. This is something that in this culture people do. And we can try to reconstruct what the logic was and what the values were to try to make it internally make sense. But that's and I think I do some of that in the book, but it's not.
Yes, you do.
That's not really the most important thing for us, because we're not supposed to replicate their logic. We just need to understand that what they're being asked to do isn't something that's outrageous. What they're being asked to do is actually something that people do quite a lot.
Okay, so can you flesh out what it is that they're being asked to do?
So you're dealing with a concept of war. What they're doing is they're waging a war.
Okay.
And in the ancient world, war isn't an ethical problem. It's a thing. It's just part of a thing that happens. It's part of basic international relations, as far as I can tell. And it's done for a variety of reasons, but it usually has to do with, there's a couple of different rationalizations for it that you can see. One of them is that the gods have decreed a certain shape of order in the world, and they've empowered and enabled their favorite king, the person that they sponsor, to go and carry out their will, essentially manifest their destiny in the world. You see this in Egypt mostly.
Okay.
Then you've got another model, which is the gods have blessed me and empowered me to do whatever I want. This is part of the benefits of being a pious, loyal servant of the gods, is that they kind of give you a blank check to do what you want. So there's like realpolitik reasons. It usually has to do with controlling trade routes and things for why they want to take territories, and they just say, I've been favored by the gods. They've blessed me. They've granted me my desires, and that's kind of demonstrated by the fact that they win war. You see that in Mesopotamia a lot. You also see a lot of the idea of, and this is when they're dealing with internal difficulties in their political structure. You have rebelled against us. You have broken the contract you made with us that you swore before the gods. You are now, we now have a responsibility to enforce the contract that you swore before the gods. We're declaring war on you, and we're going to punish you for the thing that you did, that for breaking this agreement that you had with us and our gods and your gods. Basically, that's what happens to Israel at the exile. Language they use there. So, what we see in Joshua is a specific scenario where the God turns up and tells this person, I've decided that I want you to go and conquer this territory. And we see that come up sometimes too. It's a lot less common outside the Bible than it is inside. But it's usually the idea that the God has, for whatever reason, something they want. The main one is it's King Nabonidus of Babylon wants to rebuild a temple that had been knocked down in a previous generation. So he receives a vision from his God that says, I have decided that I want you to actually break a treaty that you made with the people who now control that territory. Go and take that territory, because I have chosen you to rebuild my temple in this city. There's another account where the king of Moab lost territory in a previous generation, because he says his God was angry with him. So his God let his enemies take territory, and now when at the time he's writing, the God has changed its mind and has said, I will now empower you to go and take all of this territory back, because I'm not angry with you anymore. So we see this kind of thing show up. So what Israel is getting is kind of their own logic that they give to it is going to be kind of unique to their self-perception of what their nation is and what their God is. But what they're actually being asked to do isn't that weird. So the idea that the God has decided to grant them this territory, it's in even as far back as Exodus. I will take you up out of Egypt and bring you into the land of this list of people. They can do that. This is something that gods can and occasionally do, and you just kind of go along with it, because why wouldn't you? And the idea that they would do this by having you declare war on the current occupants isn't that weird either. This is also something that they occasionally do. And also the way that they go about declaring the war and enacting the war is also not that unusual in terms of, taking the cities, driving the people out, just kind of taking over the whole thing. This is also, it's part of the way that they do war. And there's a couple of pragmatic reasons for it. We can get into that and reconstruct it if you want, but it's more to the point that what they're being asked to do is not strange or outrageous in the world that they live in. So for us reading it, it looks weird to us. So we have to kind of translate that and get that into our head, that this wouldn't have been, this is something that does happen potentially all the time. It's not strange. it's more about why. So it's more about the reasons that the God gives for why he wants them to do this thing that the gods will occasionally ask people to do and that people are generally okay with doing. And that's the important bit that kind of carries over. And just the details of what they do and how they do it is just part of their culture that we don't understand, and it shouldn't really bother us if we don't understand it.
Right. Okay. So can you expand then on the why?
Sense.
Yeah. What's the why? Why are they doing this then?
So the why has to do with something that God is doing with Israel. So part of what we have to understand about how the Bible works is that the Bible is a record of a certain group of Israelites recording their own perception of themselves and the perception of what their God has done mostly for them. And so it's not a transcript of like a documentary of events that just happen, kind of like you'd see in a security camera with no filtering, no editing, and no presentation. It's also not, it's not God dictating a theology book. It's done in the context of people telling a story about themselves.
Okay.
And when we say that the text is inspired, what we mean by that is that God has taken this story that people wrote about themselves and about what he did for them, what he did with them, and basically given it a stamp of approval. Yes, that's right. I did that. So inspiration doesn't take away that perspective, that framing that they have of the story. It endorses it and basically says, yeah, they got it right. But when you're reading it, you still have to read it with that framing in mind.
Yep.
So the people who are writing this, as near as we can tell, and the way we tell this is by the language that it's in, the kind of Hebrew that it's written in, are writing either just after or during the Babylonian exile.
Okay.
And we know that they're consulting older documents to create this story because they cite them. There's, this is written in the Psalm of Joshua, or this is written in the Annals of the Kings of Israel. So they're citing their sources. We know they're not just making this up in Babylon. This is they're recording something that they remember. But
and Babylon, the captivity, the exile, we're looking at like end of the 6th century, 7th century, beginning of the 6th century BC, around 600 BC or so.
Thereabouts, yes.
Okay.
So they're remembering, but again, it's not a transcript of a documentary. They're not doing a forensic reconstruction of the past the way that we do when we write history. What they're doing is they're telling the story of themselves, kind of in a way to make sense of what happened to them and where they are now.
Okay.
So,
which is exile. Okay.
Which is the exile. So, and one thing that's very important to them, which you see throughout all the different various documents that they compiled to tell their story, which eventually became our Bible, is that what happened to them is not God's fault. Their God didn't mess up. Their God did not get overpowered and defeated by the gods of Babylon. Their God is extremely powerful, extremely competent, extremely capable, and is in complete control of everything. He's massively more powerful than the gods of Babylon, especially. And so they have to then try to rationalize why they lost, why was their city destroyed, why was their temple destroyed, why were they all collectively yeeted out of their land. And the way that they go about doing this is that they say, we are rebels being punished. Remember when I said earlier, one of the rationales for going to war is to punish rebels for breaking a contract that they have made. And this is how Israel the people who wrote the Bible are seeing themselves. This is how they've decided to make sense of what's happening. And part of how they do that is they frame their existence in the land in terms of one of these treaties that you would make that says, where the emperor basically says, I give you this territory, I give you self-rule over this territory. In exchange, you will be exclusively loyal to me, you will pay your tribute, you will uphold my idea of order in your realm, you will have these particular kinds of foreign relations with the people around you, and in exchange, I will secure your throne in this little portion of my empire that I've kind of delegated you to oversee. And as long as you behave, you can keep it. And if you don't behave, if you don't do what I said I would do, then I'm going to declare war on you, and I'm going to destroy this little bit of land that I gave you, and I'm going to give it to somebody else who will more properly oversee. And this is how these kinds of treaties always work. And it looks like very much like the Israelite covenant. I mean, what part of what that word means is a word that they use to describe these treaties, is what they think is happening. So a lot of these treaties come with a narrative section at the beginning. And that narrative section basically describes what the conditions were that led to this arrangement being made. So sometimes it's as simple as I invaded you and I conquered you, but in some of them it's not. Some people volunteer to get into these kind of arrangements. They kind of self-subjugate, and the narratives of these documents are all about the conditions that were present in the nation before they decided to seek help. So it's usually, you were run off the throne by rebels. You came to me and you begged me to help you get your throne back. I deployed my army. I kicked the rebels out of your land. I installed you on the throne. It's something like that. And this is a lot of what we also see in the books of the Pentateuch, in Exodus and Numbers and Joshua. Well, Joshua's not part of the Pentateuch, but leading up to that, where the people have cried out in Egypt for Yahweh to come and deliver them. And he has done so. And so these narratives are kind of the backstory that set up the arrangement for why Israel now has this subordinate obligation to their God, because they asked for help and he delivered them. He deployed his army. He took them out of their captivity, saved them from
Egypt, right?
Called them in their land. And this is the point of the book of Joshua. Very specifically, the point of the book of Joshua is to say that Yahweh did everything that he promised he would do when they made this arrangement. That he took them, said he was going to take them out of Egypt, and he did. He said he was going to put them in this land, and he did. Every one of the promises that Yahweh made through Moses was fulfilled. That's the point.
And it says that like in Joshua 21, right?
Yes, it says exactly that. That is the entire point of the book of Joshua. And that basically says that when everything goes pear-shaped later on, it's not because it wasn't set up right. It's not because the Emperor Yahweh didn't fill his part of the bargain correctly. It's all about their then subsequent rebellion and not doing their part. And that's why it didn't work. And it wasn't Yahweh's failure to do what they asked him to do or what they wanted him to do or what he promised he would do that led to their current predicament now in the exile. It was the Emperor Yahweh did his part, and then they didn't do theirs, and then they got punished for breaking their contract. That's the very, very brief summary of what their story is. And the role that Joshua plays in that story is showing how Yahweh did what he was going to do. And that's really the important bit. That's the emphasis of it.
Okay. So I think you've helped quite a bit. Let's go back, if I can, to the kind of the beginning question. Then we still have this ethical dilemma of, hey, go annihilate these people. And Deuteronomy 7, of course, says, go annihilate these people, take over the land. First thing that you're saying then, if I hear you, I hear two things to begin with, and maybe you can add some more to it. One is, well, haram doesn't mean like wipe them all out. It doesn't mean annihilate. It doesn't mean commit genocide per se necessarily. And secondly, I hear you saying that I almost lost my train of thought. Totally lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. I'm getting old. That we have to remember that we're dealing with an ancient text, and the ancient text and what they thought was acceptable, what we think is acceptable, are not necessarily the same thing. Okay, so help me a little bit with this original question though of what appears to be genocide and God ordained genocide. Is that what happened, or is there more to it that we need to nuance?
It's not what happened, but I think that's still kind of missing the point. I mean, what they do to the people, it's not what we would call genocide, but it's still not nice. There is no way to make it okay to do that to somebody. What they're actually doing is what the word means. If you're curious about what the word means, the best analogy that I could have is it's the equivalent of disbanding an organization. So they're taking the Canaanite culture, the organization here is a culture, and basically eliminating that. So, and again, this is not a nice thing to do to people, and it's not. We shouldn't try to. If you're trying to have this ethical discussion, you shouldn't try to make it seem like a nice thing to do to people, because it's really not. But it has to do. It helps you kind of understand what its objective is. Its objective is not the death of the people. Its objective is culture destruction, and the reason why they want to do that is because they're afraid of syncretism, cross-cultural influence. So they actually say this a bunch of times. If you don't wipe out the Canaanites, they will become barbs in your eyes, thorns in your sides. They will lead you to break your covenant, and then you will be in trouble. And then the book of Judges, of course, shows them doing exactly that. So it doesn't resolve your ethical issue if you still want to have that, but it gives you a better understanding of what is going on. This is it's more about forced assimilation than it is about genocide, because there's actually I've heard an argument which I actually kind of like, that what in that weird passage at the end of 2 Samuel where David conducts a census and God gets angry at him for doing that. And a lot of people, like, we've for years wondered what's so bad about doing that. And this was my brother actually wrote this article. He says that what counting the fighting men means is that they actually took all of the Canaanite people that had remained in the land while David was the king, and just basically said, yeah, you're all Israelites now, and just erased the distinction. And that this is kind of not what they were supposed to do. But we do see, like in the example of Rahab as an example, somebody who they just kind of take and assimilate into their culture. That's kind of more what they're supposed to be doing. And the reason why they talk about putting people to the sword instead of like forceful re-education or something like that is because of how important ethnicity is to culture in their world. Like we associate culture most of the time more with ideology, so it's something you can change if you want to.
At least in the American Western culture.
In the American West, but in the ancient world, your ethnic and your tribal and your ancestral heritage is much more of a part of your identity than your ideology, and it's not something you can really change.
Okay.
So, and not only can't they wouldn't want to.
Okay.
So it's not like they're like sitting there begging to be allowed to become Israelites and getting killed at the same time. It doesn't work that way. Because even the people who do try to avoid getting attacked, they don't say, you know, we want to become circumcised and be Israelites now. This is the Gibeonites in Joshua 9. They say, we're from a land far away. We're from outside this jurisdiction, which means you can play nice. You can play nice with us, even though we're not part of you. And it makes a point later in 1 Samuel that the Gibeonites were not a part of Israel, even though they're allowed to live alongside them. And so again, this is not in any way a nice thing to do to people, and there's no way to make it. There's no way to make it nice with what our values are. But it helps you understand what they're trying to do, and then to a further extent of why.
Okay, so let me comment on that, and then we have a question. And that is, it sounds to me a little bit like what we did and what the Canadians did to the Native Americans, where we forced to assimilate them. Like, you can no longer speak your cultural language. You can no longer dress the cultural way. You must become Canadian. You must become American. You can no longer have your tribal language. And that's what you're saying. That's not a nice thing to do.
It is a little bit like that, and it's not a nice thing to do.
Okay. All right. The question then comes up, which is kind of, I think, reiterating what I've just simply said there, and that is, did Yahweh command the actual killing of men, women, and children to enforce this assimilation? That was one of the questions from our viewers.
It looks like he did.
Okay.
And again, it's the way that. So the question is, why do we ask that question? Why does that matter to us?
Right.
And it's because we really, really, really want God to have the same values that we do. And it bothers us when we think that he might not or doesn't. But basically, it's not, the Bible's not interested in showing us a picture of a God that has the same values that we do. If anything, it's going to be showing us a God that has the same values of the people who wrote the book. And they don't necessarily have a problem with killing men, women, and children, based on other rhetoric that we see both in the Bible and outside of it. This doesn't seem to be the problem for them that it is for us, at least not inherently.
Yeah. Would it be part, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Wouldn't part of it be helping us, like, for us to get into that world, is to recognize the tribal nature of those societies? That it was one of those things that, hey, you got your family over there, you got your clan over there, I got my clan over here. We get along with one another, but I'm worried the fact that you're having more kids than I, and eventually your clan's getting bigger than I, and there's just always this perceived threat.
We can try to reconstruct the internal logic.
Yeah.
That's there's always going to be some. There's a lot of speculation about that. And it's exactly. Whether or not we got it right, especially because we have our own filters and biases. Shoot!
Lost your camera. Lost your camera. That's okay. All right, we can still hear you. Just be aware of the fact that we can still hear you.
Okay. So, yeah, I don't know what just happened.
No worries. All right. Okay. Well, let me give you a minute to do that, and I'm gonna give a commercial interruption. How's that? Okay. Let me give a commercial interruption here. Okay. So thank you everyone for tuning in. I appreciate your faithfulness there. Whether you're watching us live or whether you're watching us record here on the YouTube channel. Determinetruth is a 501c3 and nonprofit. We make these events free of charge. Our goal is never to hide anything we do: the podcast, the blog, live streams, webinars, anything behind a paywall. We don't want to say, well, if you can't afford it, bummer for you, but this isn't for the poor. This is only for those who can afford it. We want to make everything available to everybody. But in order to do that, we are going to rely upon those of you who are able to give. So if you are able to give $5, $10, or a monthly amount of $10 or $25, whatever it might be, $2 million, that'd be great too. Go to determinetruth.com. and click on the Give tab and make a donation. We'd appreciate that. But we intentionally set these webinars up and live streams up without having a fee attached to them, because we don't believe that we want to do that. So we want to encourage you to do that. Go to determinetruth.com also to find out more about what we do. We work with 100 pastors in India every single week. We have lots of different things, and our YouTube page has lots of information on it also. So I want to encourage you to do that. So Jonathan, thanks. You're back here. So thank you. Now,
Sorry about that.
Another element of that, I'm not sure if you had a thought that you wanted to finish, feel free to do so. But another element of that is there is a measure of hyperbole, right? That's been one of the ways we kind of toned down Joshua. It says that drove everybody out. It says they killed everybody, but the next chapter, they're sitting there, and in the book of Judges, it's like, yeah, they're all around you.
And everybody's still there. Again, I think it is true, but I think it's largely an exercise in missing the point. So a lot of the things we do when we're trying to reconstruct this logic, which is usually kind of more about our logic. It says more about the kind of things we think about and think would be reasonable than necessarily what they did. And trying to talk about things like hyperbole. This is still trying to somehow make it okay, make God doing something that we would be okay with God telling us to do. Right. And I think that that's a fundamentally misguided approach, because we shouldn't expect it to do that. We shouldn't expect God to be doing things that we would like any more than we should expect God to be speaking English. And so it's kind of like, it almost feels like that thing that people do where they assign numbers to Hebrew letters, and then they assign numbers to English letters, and they add up the numbers and try to make the Hebrew words into English words. That's what it feels like you're doing. And that's kind of
what the text was not designed to do. That
need it. You don't need it to make sense to us. It's not designed to cater to our moral sensibilities, because we didn't exist when they wrote it. Our culture didn't exist when they wrote it. And so it's more about understanding what it would have meant to them, what its significance would have been, why they decided to tell this story at all, not necessarily in why they told it in that way, because the way they like using hyperbole in conquest rhetoric means something. It's part of, it shows the overwhelming success of whatever project they were trying to do. So, and we can figure that out, and we can compare that, and when we're doing our analysis, we can take that into account. And again, since its point is Yahweh absolutely and unqualifiedly did everything that he said he was going to do, the hyperbolic rhetoric enforces that. Because that's what it's for.
Okay. All right, makes sense. Now, so William Webb, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work or not. He argues that the divine commandments are God accommodating to the ethic of that day. That Yahweh was an uneasy war god, a reluctant war god, he says, and that's why Webb argues that God did not allow David to build a temple, was because his answer is, well, you're a warrior, and I'm not that kind of person. How much of that of William Webb's argument would you accept there?
None. Again, it's
interesting.
Based on this fundamental idea that we need God's values to be the same as ours. So we want to project our values onto God. And it's, the reason why it says David's not allowed to build the temple. My argument for why that is because it wasn't because David was a warrior, because Solomon does a fair share of killing as well. It's more that David's reign is incredibly tumultuous. He gets usurped halfway through it. So it's more that the kingdom isn't stable in the time of David. And the part of what the temple represents is the divine emperor here, Yahweh, because their theology is political. It takes place in a political metaphor. So they want to, the temple is it's both a temple, but it's also the monument that says, this is our territory, this is part of the empire, this is secure and stable, and we are okay, we the empire are okay with putting our name on this and saying that this is part of ours. And David doesn't really achieve that, because his reign is still really unstable. So, and there's even a giant succession controversy that comes after him.
Yep.
And so they need to get that resolved. They need to get the dynasty established, and they need to get some sense of the government in Israel stabilized before the emperor, Yahweh in this case, is willing to say, yeah, this is my place. I'm going to, the idiom that they use in both in imperial monuments and in Deuteronomy for this, I'm going to place my name here. Basically associate it with himself and say, this is mine. I approve of this. This is something that's okay for me to claim and be a part of. And the temple is the main signifier of that. And so it's not that David was the wrong kind of person. It's that David never achieved in his lifetime the kind of stability that they wanted to have before Yahweh would be willing to sign off on it, basically.
Okay, that's so let's take this. Thank you. One of the great things that you do in the book that I like, this is gold, is the way you apply this to a New Testament ethic. Before we get there, and I want to get there's two prongs to that question. One last kind of outstanding question, if you can address it briefly, and that is, in 1 Samuel 15, I know this is outside of Joshua, it describes the destruction of the Amalekites, or Amalek, right? So what is that about, and how does that fit into this whole larger picture? Was it a God-ordained destruction? Was it total annihilation? And is that different from the Joshua account, and how so?
I think this is still fundamentally based on cultural destruction. Because they don't make a point of, killing every last man, woman, and child of this entire ethnic group. They kill the king and they beat the army. And so it kind of basically does away with any of the foundations that they would have had to kind of form their identity around. And this is actually, it's a fairly standard procedure that you do when you conquer somebody. When this is one that people aren't necessarily aware of. When Sennacherib comes to Jerusalem in 2 Kings to challenge Hezekiah, he basically says that he has utterly destroyed, the same word, all of the other nations around them. And again, we know from Assyrian imperial policy what that looked like when they did it to the northern kingdom. They basically take away everything, all of the community and social structures and infrastructures that the conquered people could potentially rally around to be able to stage a rebellion or at least set up a kind of counterculture. They make sure you can't do that. That's what its objective is. So, and the Amalekites are a little bit different because it's framed as this is a retribution for something that they did to Israel. So the internal logic of it's a bit different. This isn't the God saying, I've decided I want to give you this thing. This is, these people have committed some offense against you and need to be punished for it. So it's closer to that form of rhetoric. But again, since it's still just they're having a war, and this is how you have wars, and the rhetoric around it helps you figure out what's happening, why the war is important to have. But it's not. You can pretty much just read into it, and they did a war, and that's
All right, so let's take
the rest of the details are just
right,
about how to do a war.
Okay, excellent. All right. There's another comment there I want to get to in the comment.
It's not what happens now. It isn't actually important. It's about what all do.
Sorry, we're getting a little bit of a technical glitch there. I apologize. All right, so two-pronged in terms of the taking this to the forward. Okay, I'm not sure who's breaking up, you or me. Sorry about that, but taking this to the present there, and two things. One, I want to address the question of what you talk about, what harem means for the people of God today, what it looks like in the church. But you're probably aware that the book of Joshua and the story of Joshua and even the Amalekites and the destruction of the Amalekites is appropriated today in the war that's going on in the Middle East, in Israel, Gaza, and the idea that many Christians will adhere to say, hey, this is God giving the land of the Jewish people, and therefore the Palestinians need to go. And it's just taking the Joshua and appropriating it to the present day. And I think you strongly feel that's not acceptable. Can you speak to that just for a bit?
That's not acceptable, no. And again, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what kind of story this is. This is going back to we're trying to diagnose God's ethics so that we can figure out our ethics. And that's not even what the people who wrote it were trying to do. They were telling a story about what God did for ancient Israel. So now, of course, understanding that, we have to think about, well, what is the significance of the story of what God did for ancient Israel? Why should we care? And one of the implications of that is that, this is exactly what God wants his people to always do. And that comes across in what's happening in Israel. It comes across in what happens when the Christian kings in Europe decided to go on crusades. This is right. God wants his people to attack the foreigners and put them all to the sword. And that's what that is you're trying to figure out what this story of Israel means for you. We know what it meant for them, but then, and it doesn't really give you a guide for that. This is all entirely your own assumptions. So a lot of what gives you the problems, both for the people who don't want to put people to the sword and are concerned that God told them to do that, or for the people who want to put people to the sword and are looking for an excuse to do it, it's still this assumption that, the significance for this is either giving us instructions or decoding God's ethics. And I don't think it does either of those things.
Okay. So now, before I go to the next question, in terms of what you think this means for us in the New Testament world or in the people of God today, one of the questions that came in now was kind of a follow-up, and it says, it seems that what you're saying is that God shares the values of all the other gods of the ancient Near Eastern cultures. How could a Native American understand this as good news? How would you respond to that?
I mean, you could ask how a non-Native American could understand this as good news. We're not ancient Near Eastern either. And it more has to do with, I don't think it's teaching that God shares these values. I don't think that God waited for a civilization in the ancient Near East to come up with all of these ideas of what humans should look like, what society should look like, what government should look like, what justice should look like, and then said, oh yes, you finally got it right, I'm going to reveal myself to you now. I don't think it works that way. I don't think that those are God's values any more than I think God actually speaks Hebrew. It's more the idea that God is willing to work with what you have. And I think that can be potentially good news for anybody. It means that you don't have to get it right before God has any use for you or before God can have any interaction with you. The idea that God was willing to meet the Israelites where they were at and use their understanding of how the world worked and still do things anyway. He didn't have to wait for them to get right first, just like he didn't have to wait for them to learn English so that he could speak to them in English. And so I think it's the idea that that you have a God who is willing to work within your values and kind of meet you where you are I think is good news for everybody.
Okay. And those who appropriate it to say that I'm using this for the conquest of the Native Americans, or I'm using this for the conquest of Palestinians, or I'm using this for the conquest of any of America's wars of aggression, are misappropriating the text. That's simply not what the text is doing. It's describing an historical episode that doesn't transfer as a divine dictum saying that, and therefore all God's people are to act this way. Okay. Now,
they're misinterpreting their.
Okay, so another question has come in, that is, so did the ancient Israelites believe that they actually heard from God and fulfilled his will in the conquest, or that similar to other ancients, they appropriated God language to justify their actions? Or is it some semblance of both?
It's hard to tell because, as far as we know, the belief in the gods and the divine will and command was sincere for everybody, including the other ancient Near Eastern cultures. We don't really see, like when we try to reconstruct them, since we now today either don't believe in any gods at all, or at least don't believe in ancient Near Eastern gods. We assume that they didn't really either, and that they invented religion as a way to control people, and the gullible people fell for it. But the people who were in charge didn't actually believe in the religion. This is your Karl Marx hypothesis, and there's not really a lot of evidence for that. As far as we know, we think that everybody believed that their gods communicated with them in one way or another. What we don't know necessarily is what they thought that looked like. So we can assume that the people of Israel would have thought that they were in line with the divine will and commands as much as anybody else did, which is entirely. We don't know if they would have thought that they were receiving like exactly the kind of communications that get described, because a lot of those they have a rhetorical or symbolic element to them, which doesn't mean that God couldn't have done that. Maybe he did. There's no reason why he couldn't have. But that's also not really important. It's more that are they depicted as being pious or impious? Are they like when the kings of Israel are doing things, or when the people under the judges are doing things, are they being depicted as pious or impious? Are they listening to the gods or aren't they? And you can see this again. Everybody does this when you can accuse. It's actually very common to accuse your predecessor, especially if you're a usurper of some kind, that he did not listen to the gods. He wasn't pious. He ignored the gods, and that is why his throne was taken away from him. So you see this kind of thing happening all the time. And we have no real reason to think that they didn't believe that this was occurring one way or another. We just don't have the information to reconstruct exactly what it would have looked like.
Now, I guess let me just ask a follow-up question on that. I know we're running low on time here, and I thank you so much for your time. And that is, I think that Dan Hawk would say, and I think you would agree a little bit, that there's multiple sources, right? That you seem to indicate that this is written maybe during the exile, somewhere around there, and they're using some other sources. And Dan seems to indicate that they were wrestling with the sources and the ethicalness of the of what they were writing about. Also, do you affirm that part of it, of maybe his thesis?
I think that that's pretty unlikely. The way that we know about how they dealt with sources we don't have any of the sources in the Bible.
Right.
We do have sources of other literature that was compiled from sources in around the same time. And so we're assuming that the literary production process would have been similar. And what we basically see is that they keep a lot of the essence of the story, but they switch the details around and sometimes even switch the emphasis around because to suit whatever purpose they are now using it for. So I wouldn't say we know. We have no reason not to believe that they don't have a memory of these wars happening. They cite sources that they said, this is where we got the details of which cities they conquered. And many of them, we got them from these annals. We got them, all of the deeds of this king are recorded in the annals of history of Judah. And we have no reason to think that those documents wouldn't have existed. We just never found them. But we also have no reason to think that they're transcribed, that this is, they're putting their own spin on the story. And what's important to remember for our purposes as theologians is that it is the text that we have that is inspired, not the sources. So
Right.
the thing that God put his stamp of approval on and says, yes, that is me, I did that, is not any source that they might have used, which, again, we don't have them. We have no idea what they would have said. It's the final version that we have, and that includes whatever they were trying to tell, which was not a forensic reconstruction, because we have no record of anybody, like even before the modern period, really, even attempting to do that.
Okay. Now, we got. I apologize that we only have a couple minutes left for this last question, which I think is one of the best parts of your book, and that is, or one of the most significant parts, and that is that you make the statement that Christians are supposed, that harem and the New Testament. What is harem? Utterly devoting, utterly whatever. Christians are supposed to surrender the right to make use of themselves and turn themselves over to God for His use. Is that what does harem look like, or what does this look like for us today? How's that?
So this has
In
to
2
do
minutes.
with the question of what does this mean for us? What does the story of Israel mean to people who aren't Israel and who aren't in an exile that they have to make sense of? And the basic argument that I make for this is that what this is it's a demonstration about how God interacts with the world, and specifically how God interacts with human power structures. So what's the most important point of the whole covenant story to take forward for people who aren't a part of it, or who don't really have anything to do with its history, is that who did God make this agreement with? This is a cosmic deity who most of the time would be making these kind of patronage agreements with the most powerful people in the world. He'd be like the patron of Egypt, and had been raised up this massive global superpower in order to manifest his will supremely in the world. This is what cosmic deities do. So the fact that Israel is, from a human power perspective, a nobody. They're an insignificant people in an insignificant territory. They never have any power and any significance, is what really the point is. It was what was important to them, why they told this story, because they're trying to explain how their God, this powerful cosmic deity, is still looking after them in the exile and beyond, despite the fact that they are now completely disempowered and disenfranchised as far as human power goes. And it's this demonstration of God's interaction with power that I think is the ongoing significance of the Hebrew Bible for other people. And it's what the New Testament starts to interact with. And the New Testament takes this idea of God's interaction with human power to an even greater extent, to the idea where it eliminates God, like it fundamentally severs the identity of the people of God from any human power structure at all.
Okay.
And that includes any of the kind of other demographic, cultural, political identities that we have, to become like fully devoted citizens of a kingdom not of this world. And there's a metaphor for this in the way that the covenant worked and how the covenant works now, in terms of kind of what it means to get rid of some of this, these competing power structures that compete for your devotion to Yahweh, because that's what the Canaanite cultures represented. That's why they wanted to get rid of them. And so that's what I was trying to argue based on some of the parallel imagery and some of the parallel language in the New Testament, is that the idea is it's about this same idea of potential syncretism, potential contamination of your identity as the people of God, which in Israel meant the people of this kind of imperial client state.
Clan,
The Christians, it's a kingdom not of this world. So the idea of preventing this contaminating influence by getting rid of the things that could produce it, which are, in this case, internal. Things that compete for your identity and for your personal devotion within yourself.
Okay. Very good. All right. Which is seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. And it's certainly what I think the book of Revelation is about. And if you've been following along with Determined Truth, we're doing a series on the book of Revelation right now. on the Determined Truth podcast. All right. So one passing comment that a question or a comment that I neglected to ask you, but you make a really good argument that the destruction of the Canaanites what was not because of the Canaanites' sinfulness, but simply because of the fear of assimilation in there. The Canaanites weren't even described as sinful. I thought you did an excellent job with that as well. So I just want to thank you again for your time with us. Your explanation, I thought was great.
Thank you.
I guess my difficult question remains a difficult question. I don't think that's gone away, but I think we have a better grasp of maybe some ways to approach it, and I appreciate it. And your book is up in the top right-hand corner of the screen there. And I encourage people to get a copy of the book. It's titled again, "The Lost World of Israelite Conquest, Covenant, Retribution, and the Fate of the Canaanites." And I thank you so much for being with us. All right. So thank you, everyone. Take care. All right. You can stay here for a second if you want.